warm welcome. My name is Josef Lensch. I am the founder and CEO of Partisan and the Political Tech Summit. It's great to have you with us today, and it's great to have Eric with us today, who I'll introduce in a minute. Let me just introduce today's topic. As you know, we are doing reviews, we're doing deep dives. Today, we're doing a preview. We are about a month a year before the US midterm elections, which will largely take place in November 2026. Of course, they are as always, they will be quite interesting in terms of what the result will be, what their impact will be. And so today we're going to discuss particularly the political tech perspective. So what can we expect in terms of the digital game? What will campaigns use? How will potentially AI be deployed? What innovations can we expect? And so it's my pleasure and my honor to welcome Eric Wilson, who is the executive director at Campaign Trend, who will give us insights into all of this. He's a veteran political technologist. I've had the pleasure to meet you, Eric, in DC about, I think, a year and a half ago at the Campaign Tech Conference. Eric is a veteran political technologist. He's been involved in US Senate and presidential campaigns, and he's certainly one of the most influential voices on campaign innovation. He's also got an excellent newsletter that I really can recommend, which everyone who hasn't already subscribed to should subscribe. He doesn't just understand the tools, but really how campaigns actually implement them under pressure. Also, I'm very sorry to say Eric won't be able to make it to the Political Tech Summit as he and his wife are expecting, I think it's the third child. So
The
congratulations.
third child. I have a good excuse this time.
It's a really good excuse. But the next time, hopefully in 2027, we'll be able to bring you over and have you here in Berlin. We're of course very glad and delighted to have him with us today. Eric will kick things off with some observations, and then I'll ask him some questions. And then, of course, again, please feel free to come in at any point from the audience. Eric, kick us off. Kind of how's your perspective? And if you want to tell us a few things about Campaign Trend and the work that you do, please feel free to.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. So, a couple of things. My background is in the digital data tech side of campaigning, and have for the last 5 years have really been focused on really understanding this aspect of campaigning. I am a Republican. I do represent the center right of our political spectrum here, and but I do keep a close eye on the competition, as it were, and I spend a lot of time, sort of trying to understand this ecosystem. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out how voters are motivated, how do they use technology, where do they get media from? So one of the really cool things that we've been doing is, tracking the rise of podcasting in politics. And so it was really cool to see that in 2024, where, just 4 years later, 4 years earlier, it was a rounding error in our polling to now being on par with sort of cable news consumption among voters. So that's the kind of work that we do at the Center for Campaign Innovation, and eager to give you some insights about what's going on in the midterms. So to do that, I brought a little bit of some slides to give us context, just because that's always helpful for me to organize my thoughts. But I think the one thing that I would note context-wise, it's really important, is that first of all, the U.S. House of Representatives does elections every 2 years, so without fail. It is separate, of course, from our presidential elections. We do not have a parliamentary system. I'm telling you things that you already know, but it's important context here. And so it is possible in the middle of a president's term to get divided government, which always makes things very, very tricky. Another piece of context that you may not have is we had elections in 2 states earlier this month. Now, the whole world watched the New York City mayoral race, which is well and good, fun to look at. But New York City is a totally different planet unto its own. But we did get an early glimpse at what we call off-year elections in New Jersey and Virginia, where I live. And so I'm going to share some of the research that we've already done there with you today as well. So, quick context setting, there are 435 seats in the United States House of Representatives. Why 435? There's not really a good answer, but that's just what they decided to cap it at in the early 20th century, and that's where we are. You can see that we have 3 vacancies here. If you don't want to do the math at home, 218 is the majority in the House of Representatives, and it is a majority rule legislative body. You basically, your party decides what moves, what doesn't, what gets debated, that sort of thing, when you're in the majority. So right now, Republicans have an edge just barely. This is one of the reasons you saw 2 years ago the speaker fight, where there was argument over who could be the speaker. It was a hard battle. So and that speaker role is very important. It is for our European friends, think of speaker as party leader in the legislative chamber. So it's not the ceremonial speaker role. Okay, so you can see what a razor thin margin Republicans have in the House of Representatives. I know that the speaker checks on the health of several members on a daily basis because it is that razor thin. The other thing you need to understand is that there is a midterm curse, which is that since 1946, the average midterm loss for the president's party is 25 U.S. House seats. So if you go back, you can identify a couple of things. 1934, FDR was able to keep some seats. We were right in the middle of the Great Depression. 1998, Bill Clinton, probably one of the most charismatic politicians of all time, was able to keep seats. And then 2002, immediately following the attacks of September 11th, George W. Bush was able to keep seats, but not even, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, every president loses seats. So I think one of the things that I focus on is, yes, technology, but some things, a lot of things that affect an election's outcome are beyond the control of a campaign. So I try to talk a lot about it's sort of like the rules of physics or weather. There are just some of these factors that we can't overcome, but we can certainly be aware of them and figure out how we mitigate them. So the average is a 25 seat loss. You can see in the midterms following Trump's election, it was minus 54 seats. Okay, so the White House and President Trump's team know this. They know that they're facing pretty significant headwinds. So what's the solution? Well, we call it redistricting. Some people may like to refer to it as gerrymandering. I remind everyone that gerrymandering is named after a Democratic governor of Massachusetts, Edmund Gary. And so it is a tradition going back over hundreds of years in the United States tradition. But you can see here, there are several states that have the capacity to do what we call mid-cycle redistricting. Normally, redistricting happens every 10 years after our decennial census, right? Because the idea is we're limited to 435 seats in the House of Representatives, and the way that those lines get drawn is by measuring the population, dividing it by 435, and that's the size of a congressional district, with each state guaranteed at least one. All right. You may have seen some of the headlines, but an effort passed in California to redraw their maps, very heavily Democratic. Illinois is going to try and redraw its maps. They are one of the most gerrymandered states in the country. So some of these states have very little room to kind of squeeze more Republican-favored districts out of the redistricting. It seems like the effort in Texas is starting to backfire, where it may not work. But just to put some numbers around this, we're talking about potentially, at the best case scenario, giving Republicans a net of 7 seats, 7 new seats out of the redistricting. Again, that is best case scenario. We're probably not going to see best case scenario. One of the challenges is that even with all of the redistricting efforts, there just aren't that many swing districts left. That's largely because the states have really drawn um, what amount to non-competitive districts. So this is a rating from Cook Political Report, where you can see that about 18 seats are considered swing state or swing seats. Um, Republicans and Democrats start off with 180 safe seats uh, and then we have the leans, the likelies, and the toss-ups. So really, the battle is going to be in that middle there, where there are those toss-up races. These are the districts that Donald Trump or Kamala Harris would have won in the presidential election, but they've got a Republican sitting in the congressional seat. Those sorts of factors are at play, where sort of kind of the high turnout of a presidential year helped boost someone. Or think about it in a state like you know New Jersey or New York, where Donald Trump didn't win the presidency, but he boosted turnout in those Republican-leaning areas, and so a Republican was able to win that seat. All right, adding this all together, campaigns here have become a game of inches or centimeters, if you will, where um, we're looking at a very small universe of seats with very tight margins. So campaigns are won within percentages of victory. Counting is very precise, as you might imagine, in that case, which is one of the reasons why it's starting to we're finding out who won later and later in the election cycle. All right, so if we're playing a game of very small margins, what are we talking about? We're talking about maybe 50,000 voters deciding control of the United States Congress. That's really the swing audience here. So you start to see just how important it is that we get this right from our campaign technology and strategy. So I want to share one of the big challenges that we are facing here in the United States. And this is from polling that we did in New Jersey and Virginia just 2 weeks ago after their election. What I want you to know is that New Jersey, you register in your political party. Virginia, we have good modeling of what your political party is, but you don't register. And so the four colors here, red is they get linear ads only. So they're watching traditional TV via satellite, cable, bunny ears, as we call them, over the antennas. And then the purple are people who watch that traditional TV and streaming services that have advertising. Blue is they're getting streaming ads only. So things like Netflix with ads or Hulu with ads, where they're watching these services that permit political advertising. The black selection are the people who are we designate ad unreachable. They're not watching TV, so they can't see our ads there. And if they are watching streaming services, they're watching streaming services that don't have advertising or don't allow political advertising. Okay, so the independent voters, the ones in the center, the ones that we need to reach and persuade, are some of the hardest voters to get a hold of. We're not able to reach them with sort of our traditional methods. Another challenge that we face with AI, and this is an issue being debated in Washington as we speak, is this patchwork of AI regulation. So there's concern from it from like the commercial side, which is it's going to be difficult to compete if with China, with Europe, if our regulations are done on a state by state level. A real sort of illustrative microcosm of this is what's happening with the use of political AI on political campaigns. So 27 states have passed their own laws specifically related to the use of artificial intelligence in political campaigns. Now, they all have different triggers. Some say, any use of AI is going to enact that or require that you comply with this statute. Some are saying if it's deceptive, you may ask, well, what is deceptive? We don't know. Some of that's in the eye of the beholder. And then there are a range of requirements. Some have disclaimers. Is it the same disclaimer? No. Every state has a slightly different disclaimer. And then what's the punishment? Well, some states you can go to jail for using AI in political campaigning. Some states you can be removed from the ballot. Other states it's just a fine or a warning. So one of the things that we're really confronting right now, and this is going to color our discussion about AI usage in campaigns, is what does the state say? So each individual state has its own rules. Several of these state laws are probably unconstitutional given our First Amendment rights with free speech. But the question is, who wants to be the test case? You have to be the guinea pig to take it to court. The other thing that makes this a challenge is we have the parties that are national. We have national groups. Each state is totally different. So this has really created a chilling effect in a lot of ways for how we use AI to do things like video and images. So a lot of the cool things that you're seeing with, Nano Banana from Google or things like this, we're just not able to do because the risks are so great. So with that, I want to pause the slides and we can talk further about kind of the specific technologies that we're seeing. But I think that context is really important for understanding where we are. And so AI is being used internally quite a bit by campaigns, but you probably won't be seeing it forward facing because of those risks. How is it being used internally? Well, I think as everyone knows, using it for drafts, emails, blog posts, press releases, website content, all those sorts of things. We are doing that. About a third of political consultants that have been surveyed say that they use AI daily. So this is now just sort of part of knowledge work, and campaigns are another part of that. Another area where it's being used is in sort of remixing content. So think about taking a webinar like this or someone appearing on a podcast or doing an interview and then uploading it to an AI tool like Opus or Capwing are two examples. And then AI transcribes that, puts captions on it, and cuts it down into a 60-second video that you can post on TikTok or Reels or YouTube Shorts. Another area I touched on, which is transcription, is incredibly valuable for campaigns. So think about all of the media interviews that someone gives, or what we call them gaggles, sort of like a gaggle of goose. Whenever when you're talking to reporters and recording that and then turning that text into a library of past statements that the candidate has made, you can turn that into blog posts. Social media, all of those sorts of things are incredibly valuable, and AI makes that easier than ever. But where it stops is anything that a voter is going to see without sort of human intervention. So photos, videos, audio, we just are not able to use because the regulations, either by the platforms themselves or the states, are just too uncertain right now that we don't. It's going to be done as a gimmick, very carefully vetted by attorneys, or not used at all. More on the back end, we're starting to see we've been using machine learning for voter modeling for years. So you saw in that chart where we have models of who's likely a Republican, who's likely a Democrat, and who do we not know enough about, and we would call those an independent. That's all done with artificial intelligence machine learning. Where we're starting to extend that is using things like synthetic polls, where rather than asking real people questions, we ask AI people questions. We're starting to see that more and more. Some of the data analysis, an area we call causal inference. So rather than looking at past behavior and predicting future behavior, say, this is a person who votes in every election, so they're likely to vote in this election. We're then looking at how's the best way to contact a voter. So as voters get more and more difficult to get a hold of and reach, we can say, oh, this voter is most likely to be reached via streaming, and here are the services that they're on, or this is the best time of day to knock on a voter's door. These are the kinds of ways that we're starting to see this generative AI used. One of the frustrations I think that we have, Joseph, is these regulations. Who follows the laws? It's the good guys, and they are trying to prevent the obvious harm of deep fakes, synthetic media, making politicians say things that they didn't. And who doesn't follow the rules? It's the bad guys. And so it makes our job a little bit more difficult. In some cases, these regulations are just so vague that campaigns have to be concerned about using Photoshop, just because anything that goes into Photoshop or Adobe is now being touched with AI. So it is a challenging time for us, but really where we are focused is how do we get our voters to the polls, and how can Republicans try and mobilize Donald Trump's coalition to support Republicans in the midterms, because the stakes, again, as the White House realizes, is expect if Democrats win the House, they're going to impeach the president. They're going to start investigating him. They'll have to negotiate with him. We're going to be looking at more shutdowns. So there's a lot of headaches that come with not getting this right. And so that's really what we're focused on for the next year.
Thanks a lot, Eric. Fascinating. So when you spoke about regulation, I mean, we in Europe often think about, Europe as the kind of the regulation hell in many ways, with kind of overshooting things that really hamper campaigning, and then on the other side of this axis, often is kind of, at least in our minds, it's India, where basically
Mhm.
anything goes in terms of AI use and what have you. But in our minds, the US really is, in a way closer to India, perhaps, than to Europe. And what you said, I would say, contrasted that a bit. That actually regulation is an issue and is a problem, and sometimes it's vague, and sometimes it's different from state to state. Would you concur with that? That it's actually also a bigger issue than we in Europe perhaps sometimes tend to think.
Yeah, I would agree with that for now. I think we're going to get it resolved through sort of working with. I work with the American Association of Political Consultants. We do advocacy for this, where we're talking to state legislators who are, again, rightly eager to sort of address the harms that could come from this technology, but doing so in a way that is, shall we say, inelegant, or using an axe when a scalpel is more appropriate. And so there will be some iterations of this. I think long term we'll get to a better place than kind of the status quo. That said, I actually point to India a lot as a good example, because most people think, hey, deep fakes or synthetic media is just all bad. But how do we see it used in India? Well, translation into local languages, more personalization of the campaign. And I think we can say these are good things to more personalize the content that people are seeing, make sure that it's in a language that they understand. And so what we try and do is highlight positive use cases of AI, particularly for these lawmakers, because again, some of this is these politicians who are in office don't want to be taken out of office and worry that they are going to be targets of these kinds of attacks. So looking for, rules that probably don't make sense in the long term.
Thanks. You recently wrote a blog. I think it was titled, "How Will Republicans Win in 2026? Nobody knows."
Yes.
And your conclusion was that actually it's all about the testing, that there's being a lot of is being testing at the moment, and of course digital tools are also used to that end. Can you give us
Mhm.
some insights into how this testing is happening, and also what kind of tools, what kind of methods are being deployed to do that?
Yeah. So after any election, especially when your party loses, everyone has ideas. Here's how we fix this. So some people are saying, we need to focus only on affordability and abandon all these other things. And other people say we need to do more podcasts or blogs or YouTube. So everyone, usually it's people who are selling the thing say that's the way you're going to win. But the fact is, we don't know what works. Increasingly, research is showing that political campaigners are bad at predicting what will move voters. And so, one of the areas that we encourage people to test on is TV advertising. Despite all of the social media and things like this, the number one expense for campaigns remains TV advertising, both on the broadcast TV, cable, and satellite. That's where we reach the most voters in sort of short order. Um, However, we spend a lot of time with the data and the modeling to figure out where we run those ads, but very little time testing what we say. And so there's been some academic research. We've replicated this on our own, where we find that spending 10% of your media budget on testing different versions of spots can actually save you money because it makes your buy more efficient. So just to kind of roughly outline what this practice looks like, is a campaign would go create a few variations of the ad that they want to run. Maybe different music, different style, different approach. It could be humorous, could be scary. And this is one area where AI can be helpful because we can create these spots more efficiently. And then we go and just like we would with an online survey, we recruit voters in the district and the state and say, what do you think about this politician? Watch some videos, and we do a randomized control trial. Some of those voters are going to see the campaign's ad. Some are just going to see an ad for Coca-Cola or laundry detergent, something like that. And then we go and afterwards we ask them, now, what do you think about so and so? And then we can see. And what we frequently find, 1 out of 4 ads actually has a negative impact on the ballot performance of the candidate. So if campaigns were just guessing, they have a 1 in 4 chance of actually paying to get a worse outcome from their ads. So that's one area where we need to test. We also need to make sure that we're looking at, we spend a lot of money on knocking on doors and going door to door and contacting voters. What are the best ways to do that? One of the challenges is people have these doorbell cameras now, or they're doing more interesting things outside of the home. So it's getting harder and harder to reach these people. So we need to figure out, okay, how do we optimize this? What are the who are the right people to send? So those are all the sorts of things that we are testing, and of course adopting this sort of scientific method. And because we need this level of rigor, because we're talking about percentages, we're talking about thousands of votes really making a difference here.
Thank you. Before I continue with my questions, I just want to remind the audience, feel free to jump in at any point and post comments, thoughts, questions. I'll try to bring you in as soon as possible. For now, regarding the testing, so some people work with tools like remesh.ai and others like to use them to scale, for example, expensive qualitative research, and
Mhm.
and try to survey people and so on. Can you give us some insight? What kind of platforms, what kind of tools are being used, and potentially also what role AI plays in that kind of testing context?
Yeah. So I think polling, short of the actual election results, polling is kind of the scorecard that we make decisions on and rely on. And that's been true for 60, 70 years in US political campaigning. It's going to be really hard to move off of that. And so where we find ourselves with polling is it is getting more expensive to reach voters, to get them to complete surveys.
Mm.
Um, And even then, we're starting to see, you know, how do we interpret that data correctly? One of the biggest challenges in kind of political polling is guessing who's going to turn out versus who's not. So in the United States, for these midterm elections, we will have sort of lower than usual turnout than sort of most countries would see for their national elections. Um, and so that creates some problems. I'm also very skeptical of the idea. I'm increasingly becoming skeptical of the fundamental idea of polling, which is the idea of we can get a representative sample of voters and then make assumptions about the electorate broadly. And I think because of our individual media diets and the platforms that we use, how can you say that, well, if my inputs are different than your inputs, that asking us the same question will produce this similar results? I'm very skeptical of that, which is why I think we need to look at more tools like sentiment analysis of social media. The challenge is that's brand new. We don't have decades of best practices behind it like we do in polling. And so there's rightfully some skepticism. We're also starting to see some people, create synthetic panels, which are, sort of not real people, but they're trained on what real people think, and sort of make predictions. Again, still new. And the question is, do you as a candidate or a campaign manager want to stake your professional career on untested technology? And so that's why people are still going to invest in polls and make a lot of decisions around that. But right now, we just, again, is one of the challenges with political use cases. OpenAI, Google, and Claude all prohibit political use cases of their AI tools. So entrepreneurs, consultants, campaigners are very reluctant to build something on these platforms because they risk them getting taken away for violating the terms of service. Now, anyone who's worked with this knows that you can kind of get around those. It's very hard to enforce, but if you're building products, it becomes a little bit easier for them to shut you down. So we've got to prove out the science a little bit. I think it's one of those things where we'll see it, in this case, be developed more in the commercial sphere and then brought over to politics in the same way that polling initially was for consumer packaged good companies. TV advertising was originally for Coca-Cola, and we brought that over into politics.
So you think that in that way, politics follows business and is a bit more risk averse potentially?
Certainly risk averse in the tactics, but much more risk willing in sort of the messaging, how we confront issues. So it's a funny push pull where people say, hey, we want political people to help us with our messaging because you guys take risks. And we look at the commercial world and say, hey, we want you to do some of our technology because you take risks. The grass is always greener on the other side.
Yeah, thanks. So you mentioned, of course, that New York is different to the other states, and the U.S. is a federal state. But then, of course, I mean, Mandani has certainly deployed some innovations. So what do you think of the stuff that he's done, like the DM chatbots on Insta and
Mhm.
other stuff that helped him scale his campaign? Do you think anything of that will show up on the Republican side as well?
I think you'll certainly see it show up down ballot. Whether we see that on the Republican side is a big question mark, and I'll explain why. Um, from our polling, and this will be intuitive to people with us today, adoption of new technology skews younger, and so in a place like New York City, where you have lots of young people, lots of really well-educated young people and wealthy young people, they're going to be early tech adopters. And so being able to use things like Instagram to turn that into action with this platform called Mini Chat, which is what your MANY chat that you're referring to, where it says reply Canvas to sign up for a canvassing shift, that kind of stuff. Makes a lot of sense in a place like New York, where you've got density, you've got a, a, large population that knows how to use the tools. Here's the challenge for down ballot campaigns, like people running for House, and specifically for Republicans. Older voters are more reliable to go vote. It's just sort of they've built the habit. You live in the same place. You know where your polling place is. You have that habit of once every 2 years of going to vote. When you're a young person, you are moving around a lot. You've got other things on your mind. You're not really plugged in civically, to your local elections. So we actually will, see the electorate be older. They are better educated, so they've been in the workforce longer. And so some of those tactics that we might see on sort of cutting edge campaigns don't really scale as well. That's really the challenge. So you look at how big podcasts were in the New York City election or even the presidential election. Well, they've got the scale. They can reach enough people. But if you're running for Congress, your district is about 800,000 people. Probably about half of them are voters, and of those voters, expect 60% of them to actually show up and cast ballots. So you start to see how it gets really small, and we go back to what works, which is TV ads and streaming ads and things like that, where we're trying to go out and find these specific people. So I hate to throw water on that, but we typically don't see big, large-scale innovations on the midterms. Those usually come with the presidential campaigns, and then they get filtered down into smaller campaigns. I think probably the best example of this would be online fundraising. Started in a presidential campaign and has now become something that every campaign does. Social media, really, led by Barack Obama. Now it's a thing that everyone does. So that's kind of the pattern we see. The midterms will be all about perfecting that. How do we make it work for those smaller campaigns?
Thanks. You said that actually it's a very, very small number of races that decides the outcome of the midterms or that are
Mhm.
competitive. Now, of course, that does not necessarily mean that those are the same races who are the most innovative ones, where the most new things are tried out, because you might, in such a situation, you might revert back to things that you know and actually are more risk averse. So, if you would make some predictions for next year, what are the races that you think have the most potential to be technologically innovative, also on the Republican
Mhm.
side? Where would you look at?
Yeah.
What races would you suggest to watch?
So a couple of things, and let's start from the principle of necessity is the mother of invention, right? And therefore innovation. Uh, I would look at campaigns that, for whatever reason, don't have the resources or the money that they need, and so therefore they have to go be creative. That's really always what surprises people.
Mm,
Unfortunately, most of that's happening in the primaries, right? Where there's an outsider challenging kind of an establishment, and they do just enough sort of innovation to kind of surprise and shock. In those really competitive races, uh, you typically are going to have more resources than you know what to do with. Not to shock my European friends on this, but some of those house races are going to we're going to spend $20 million on each one of those 18 swing districts at least. Um, and so at that point, you have totally saturated every chance. It essentially becomes kind of mutually assured destruction, where for every TV ad that they buy, we buy a TV ad. For every streaming ad they do, we do streaming ads. For every door they knock, we knock a door. And so really what the race becomes about is, do you approve of the job of the president? That really is where those most competitive races. Now, there's always a possibility that someone does something creative and boosts their turnout slightly better. I think another area where you would look for innovative races are sort of or innovations in campaigning are what we would call sort of safe seats. So think about like Senator Tom Cotton, who's running for reelection in Arkansas. He's almost certain to run for reelection, but he's someone who might want to run for president someday. So what are the things that he's going to try there in his home state in anticipation of a run nationally, or be able to go to his colleagues and say, "Hey, I tried this thing," and they will be well resourced, and it doesn't come with it the risk of, if you're running in one of these really competitive races and you say, "Hey, we're going to be really revolutionary and not run TV ads," well, if you lose, everyone's going to think that you're a fool. That we have this saying here: you don't get fired for hiring IBM, which means that doing the trusted, tried and true playbook, no one is going to criticize you, even though it may not work.
Thanks. In terms of budget, you mentioned earlier AI is being used, and it sounded to me like it's being used to become more productive by
Mhm.
help you summarize stuff and being quicker at your job. But of course, there's also been talk about potentially AI replacing junior staff on campaigns, or also AI leading to kind of budget shifts in terms of ads and so on. Can you already see that, or do you foresee that for 2026 that this will happen?
Yeah. I think one of the things that we are seeing is what I would call the hollowing out of the entry level, where there are still lots of entry level jobs on campaigns, but they're for things like knocking on doors.
Mm,
It is not I'm a communications director and I need an assistant, because my assistant is now AI. And when you're resource constrained, like a campaign, um, if you can put money towards advertising or knocking on doors that you don't have to put towards campaign staff, um, you're not going to do that. So the problem becomes, this has been how we train up new generations of political campaigners. And so I'm very concerned about what happens when we have, you can't be a campaign or a campaign manager or communications director on a campaign forever. You're going to grow up. Well, if we're having people who had no experience of that come in, I think we're going to see a lot of brain drain, or unfortunately, sort of just outsourcing to AI. And so we've got to look at, well, how do we preserve that talent pipeline? How do we um, uh, uh, develop AI systems that are going to be able to capture that sort of knowledge base? And so folks are looking at that. I mean, one of the really interesting things about AI is that your training data really is the most valuable. So if you're a polling firm that's been around for 20 years, you have 20 years worth of training data that you can now feed in AI to get really good at writing questionnaires and things like that. So I am worried that we're going to lose a little bit of the art of political campaigning, because it is both an art and a science. Um, I am concerned about what happens to that talent layer that sort of gets hollowed out. But when I'm asked, so I'm a young person, I want to get involved in campaigns and build a career out of this. My advice to them is figure out how to use AI really well, learn as much as you can about campaigns, and then fit into that, because um, it can be an unfair advantage where you're disrupting sort of incumbents who just kind of rest on their laurels and aren't trying to innovate.
Thanks. One of the reasons, of course, we're doing this webinar is because Europeans are always interested what happens in the US, where there's so much more money, of course, in the market, and again, there's a kind of still this kind of regulation difference. So when you look ahead to 2026, and of course, being mindful of all the differences in politics and political systems, but what would you say are some of the innovations that you're already seeing or that you think will emerge that might also be relevant from a European perspective, and that Europe might or should actually take on board, but also vice versa? What do you think? What's emerging that actually European campaigns should not copy?
Yeah. So I think one of the really interesting points of friction for many years has been GDPR, or I always forget the German acronym, but because Germans never know GDPR, but they know Bundesdata something. But that regulation prevents most of our tactics in the United States from flowing to Europe, where we don't need to get a voter's consent to market to them. Um, that colors a lot of, you know, how we do our modeling, how do we fundraise, things like that. You're actually starting to see more states again adopt privacy legislation. More platforms implement privacy because they're saying, "Hey, look, if we're going to do this for Europe, we're just going to do it for the whole world." And so it's kind of shutting some of those avenues down for us, where we're having to then get creative and say, instead of using digital marketing as this very precise sniper shot kind of campaign, it is now becoming a lot more like broadcast, where we're reaching large swaths of people. So I keep an eye on Europe for that reason, because I think our data and privacy is going to become, you know, not that onerous, but you know, a little bit more. Similarly, TikTok has not been used in political campaigning down ballot. You know, there was a lot of attention on Trump and Kamala Harris. Democrats use it pretty extensively. Republicans have not touched it. We're likely going to see some sort of deal from President Trump to keep TikTok active in the United States. And if it does, it's going to be really important for Republicans to get on board quickly, in the way that we've seen, you know, Friedrich Merz and other center-right parties in the European Union adopt the platform. So it is now in some demographics, the third most used social media platform, overall the fourth most used platform behind Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And so it's overtaken X. And so campaigns need to invest time on that. So that's another thing that we need to take from Europe, and I would say don't learn from us, because we're leaving an important platform untouched. The other challenge that we are confronting that I think is worth studying is fragmentation of media and attention. You know, I often say we are not just competing against Republicans versus Democrats. We're competing against all the other things that people can do with their time and attention. And so figuring out how do we, you know, create, you know, durable content, durable networks, audiences, things like that. And so the idea of a campaign being something that we just stand up for 8 weeks every 4 years, or in the case of, you know, presidential elections for, you know, 90 days, or congressional elections 90 days every 2 years, that's going away. We're seeing voters cast their ballots earlier and earlier as you know, voting becomes more accessible. We're seeing voters make up their minds earlier and earlier as we become more partisan and looking for those cues. So campaigns are really having to figure out, okay, how do I get to those people? How do I distinguish myself from my party? Because if the party is the label that matters and there aren't enough people from your party in your electorate, you might not have a chance. So figuring out how to personalize, how to create content, and one of the other key areas of innovation is relational organizing, which is something that we are invested heavily in, which is the idea of, rather than politicians talking to voters, try to get friends to talk to their friends who are voters. And we do some pretty sophisticated data targeting on top of that, which you're not able to do in Europe. But the principle applies of, can you get party members to reach out to their friends who we need to be on our side? And this, it's the same idea behind, you know, influencer marketing or podcasting, but at a smaller scale. So I think that gives a good overview of where we're going. More personalized campaigns that serve voters and serve specific voters, because we're moving away from the era of broadcast where you sort of run one TV ad and that's the message that everyone sees.
Thanks, Eric. You said that Republicans need to catch up on TikTok.
Yep.
Now, of course, where the right has a particular strength, if you look at the landscape, it seems to be podcasts and videocasts that you know, there are a lot of influencers and creators that have a lot of reach, and that actually the left is actually behind. Would you agree with that? And do you see the left, on the other hand, catching up potentially in 2026 in the context of the midterms?
Yeah. So two things that we need to talk about there. One, it goes back to necessity is the mother of invention. Why are conservatives so good at this alternative media? Well, it's because their voices haven't been welcomed on traditional media. So they had a little bit of a head start. They weren't, in some places, demonetized from places like YouTube, things like that. So they went to, podcasting, more of these open protocols. So that's why conservatives, the right, had a little bit of a head start, whereas the left were sort of content to work with traditional media. Um, as traditional media has gone down, they didn't keep pace, and so now they're kind of left in that catch up. I think catching up is fairly straightforward. The challenge though becomes this fragmentation. So I mentioned that podcasting now among voters is at about 30% listen to podcasts every week. That puts it on par with watching CNN or Fox News on a weekly basis. The problem, though, is that there are tens of thousands of podcasts to listen to. And so you're comparing that with two cable channels, and you start to see how the fragmentation comes into play. Joe Rogan, the most popular podcast in the world, most widely listened to, still only reaches about 10% of podcast listeners in the United States. So that becomes a real challenge when you're trying to reach these smaller electorates, these tens of thousands of voters that we need to persuade and mobilize for these congressional races. And so we're having to figure out how do we. It is not easy to scale. So it's very hard to make a living as a podcaster when you're only talking to voters around one city or listeners around one city. That's why you have to have a national following. So it makes it tough, which is again why I encourage campaigns to look at that relational organizing of having your friends or having your supporters talk to their friends about your campaign, because those are the influencers that are local and are trusted, rather than trying to go on Joe Rogan's podcast, because he can only have so many politicians on, and we have 435 plus people running for Congress next year.
Thank you very much. So
Yeah.
my last question for tonight would be, and you can abstain if you want to, of course, but if you would make a prediction, now, of course, you said 25 is the average loss of a party, of a presidential party in the midterms. Do you want to make a prediction? Will this be more? Will this be less? Where
Yeah.
would you put the number?
So I think probably the best thing I can do right now is offer an analysis where we look at um, in the Virginia House of Delegates race, which is sort of I think probably the nearest proxy we've had. Um, any Republicans lost uh, every district where Donald Trump won 52% or less of the vote. And so if you project that forward at a national level, which is kind of an inelegant way to do it, we're looking at about 12 to 17 seats. And so I think we're not going to see a 25 seat swing. So what does that mean? Well, we're going to be at a very tight margin for the House of Representatives, if it's just 12 seats swinging one way or the other. And I don't um, you're going to see Democrats have these same problems that Republicans have had governing the House of Representatives with such a narrow majority, um, where they're going to have leadership fights. They're going to be paralyzed, and so I don't think it's going to be good news for anyone involved. I would say to the Democrats, be careful what you wish for. You may win the House, but it's not going to be fun.
Thanks a lot, Eric. It's been
Yeah.
super interesting. And of course, to everyone here with us, you can then, of course, refer to the recording of this session. We'll also share it in a newsletter to thousands of followers, potentially tomorrow, I think, if we manage, other than or alternatively next week. But in any way, you will be able to come back to this because I think it has been super, super interesting and super fruitful. There is soon the next session on the Netherlands, which also has been a super interesting case study on D66 and how it returned again after losing the last election. And of course, as Lucy thankfully just posted, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter. But once again, please also look at Eric's pages. It's actually not one page, but it's Campaign Trend and it's the Center for Campaign Innovation. And of course, he has a great newsletter that you definitely should subscribe to as well. Thanks a lot, Eric. Very sad not to see you in January, but all the best for the next weeks to you and your family. And looking forward to seeing you again in 2026 at a later point.
Thank you, Joseph. This was great.